The cold Seattle wind cut through Nora's thin jacket like a knife. She pulled the worn fabric tighter around her shoulders, but it did little to stop the shivers that ran down her spine. Her stomach cramped with hunger, a familiar ache that had become her constant companion over the past few weeks. She stood across the street from Antonio's, watching the warm light spill from its windows onto the wet pavement. Through the glass, she could see people in clean clothes sitting at white tablecloth tables, laughing and sharing plates of food that probably cost more than most people made in a day. The smell of garlic and fresh bread drifted out each time someone opened the door, making her mouth water and her empty stomach twist even more. Nora had been walking the downtown streets for hours, looking for any opportunity to earn a few dollars. She had tried asking for work at several shops, but the moment people saw her appearance, their expressions changed. The suspicious looks, the quick no responses, the way they seemed to step back from her. She understood why. Her jeans had holes in them, her sneakers were held together with duct tape, and she hadn't had a proper shower in 3 days. But this restaurant was different. As she watched through the window, she noticed something that made her heart skip a beat. In the far corner of the dining room sat a beautiful black piano. It was a grand piano, probably worth more than most people's cars. The polished surface reflected the warm restaurant lights, and she could see the keys even from where she stood outside. No one was playing it. It just sat there, silent and waiting. Nora's fingers tingled as she stared at the instrument. It had been so long since she had touched real piano keys. Sometimes, when the public library was open, she would sneak over to their old upright piano in the community room and play quietly when no one was around. But this was different. This was a real concert piano, the kind she used to dream about playing on. A memory flashed through her mind. She was 8 years old, sitting at her grandmother's old piano, her small fingers struggling to reach the keys properly. Her grandmother's patient voice guided her through the scales, praising every small improvement. "Music is a gift, little one," her grandmother had said. "It can feed your soul when nothing else can." Now, 20 years later, standing hungry and cold on a Seattle street, those words felt both comforting and painful. She watched a couple leave the restaurant, and as the door opened, she heard something that made her stop breathing for a moment. Someone inside was attempting to play the piano badly. The notes came out choppy and wrong, like fingers stumbling over keys they didn't understand. It lasted only a few seconds before stopping, followed by laughter from the nearby tables. That settled it. She knew she could play that piano better than whoever had just tried. The question was whether she had the courage to ask. Nora checked her reflection in a storefront window. Her brown hair was tangled from the wind, and there was a smudge of dirt on her cheek from sleeping in the doorway last night. She did her best to smooth her hair and wipe her face clean. It wasn't much, but it was something. Her hands shook as she approached the restaurant's front door. Through the glass, she could see the host standing behind a small wooden podium, checking names off a list. He was probably in his 30s, wearing a crisp white shirt and black vest. His hair was perfectly styled, and his shoes looked like they cost more than she had seen in months. The warm air hit her face as she pushed open the heavy door. The sounds and smells of the restaurant washed over her, conversations mixed with the clink of silverware on plates, and the aroma of fresh pasta and wine made her stomach clench with longing. The host looked up from his list, and she watched his expression change as he took in her appearance. His professional smile faded, replaced by a look of concern and slight annoyance. "I'm sorry, but we don't allow," he started to say. "Please," Nora interrupted softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I just wanted to ask about something." The host glanced around nervously, clearly worried about how her presence might affect the other customers. Several people at nearby tables had already noticed her and were starting to stare. "Miss, I think you might be looking for the shelter. It's about 6 blocks down on Pine Street. They serve meals until 9 o'clock. Nora felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment, but she forced herself to continue. "I know about the shelter. That's not why I'm here." She took a deep breath, gathering what little confidence she had left. "I noticed you have a piano over there." The host followed her gaze to the corner where the grand piano sat. "Yes, we do. What about it?" "I was wondering if I could play something. Just one piece. In exchange for—" She paused, the words sticking in her throat. It was so humiliating to have to ask, but her hunger was stronger than her pride. "In exchange for maybe a small plate of food?" "Even just bread would be fine." The host stared at her for a long moment, and she could see the wheels turning in his head. Behind him, she noticed that more people were starting to look in their direction. A woman at a table near the piano was leaning over to whisper something to her companion, both of them glancing toward the entrance. "You want to play our piano for food?" the host asked, his voice loud enough that several more people turned to look. "I know how to play," Nora said quietly. "I'm good at it. I wouldn't embarrass your restaurant or bother your customers. Just one song and then I'll leave." The host's expression shifted from annoyance to something that might have been amusement. "Ma'am, that's a very expensive instrument. It's not a toy. We can't just let anyone who walks in off the street." "I understand that," Nora said, her voice growing a little stronger. "But I'm not just anyone. I really can play. If you give me a chance, I think your customers might enjoy it." The conversation was drawing more attention now. She could feel eyes on her from all around the restaurant. Some people looked curious, others seemed annoyed by the disruption to their evening. A few were already reaching for their phones, probably thinking this would make an interesting story to share. The host looked around at his customers, then back at Nora. She could see him weighing his options, probably thinking about how to handle the situation without causing a scene. "Please," she said one more time, putting everything she had into that single word. "Just give me one chance." The host stared at Nora for what felt like an eternity. Then slowly a smirk spread across his face. He turned slightly toward the dining room, raising his voice just enough for the nearby tables to hear. "Did everyone hear that?" he announced, his tone dripping with fake amazement. "This lady thinks she can walk in here and play our $15,000 piano for a free meal." A few customers chuckled, and Nora felt her face burn with shame. She wanted to disappear, but her feet seemed frozen to the floor. "Tony, what's going on over there?" called a voice from behind the host. A short, balding man in an expensive suit approached them, his face already showing irritation. This had to be the manager, Nora thought. His name tag confirmed it. Manager Vincent. "We have a situation here, Mr. Vincent," the host said, barely containing his laughter. "This woman wants to perform a concert in exchange for dinner." Vincent looked Nora up and down, taking in every detail of her worn appearance. His expression grew colder with each second. "Ma'am, this is a respectable establishment. We don't run a charity kitchen here." "I'm not asking for charity," Nora said quietly, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm offering to work for it. I can really play the piano." "Oh, you can really play?" Vincent repeated, his voice mocking. He turned to address the growing crowd of onlookers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apparently have a concert pianist among us this evening." More people were paying attention now. Phones were coming out, held up to record what was clearly becoming entertainment for the diners. Nora could hear whispered comments from the tables around them. "This is going to be good," someone muttered. "Poor thing probably thinks hitting." "A few keys counts as playing," another voice added. "Should we call security?" asked a woman at a corner table. Vincent held up his hand to quiet the room. Now, let's not be hasty. If this young lady thinks she's qualified to touch our Steinway, maybe we should give her a chance to prove it." The way he said "prove it" made Nora's stomach sink. This wasn't kindness. This was cruelty disguised as opportunity. "You know what?" Vincent continued, his voice growing louder and more theatrical. "I'll make you a deal. You have exactly 1 minute to show us what you can do. If you can actually play something recognizable, I'll personally buy you a meal. But if you waste our time with noise, you leave immediately and don't come back." The dining room had gone almost completely quiet now. Everyone was watching, waiting for what they clearly expected to be a disaster. Nora could see people adjusting their phones to get better angles for recording. 1 minute, Vincent repeated, tapping his expensive watch. "Starting the moment you sit down at that bench." Nora's hands were shaking now, not just from hunger but from pure anxiety. She looked around the room at all the faces staring at her. Some looked amused, others annoyed, a few seemed genuinely curious, but none looked particularly kind. "What's the matter?" the host asked with false concern. "Having second thoughts? We can still call that shelter for you." "No," Nora said, her voice barely audible. "I'll do it." She started walking toward the piano, and she could hear the conversations resuming behind her. People placing bets on how badly this was going to go. $10 says she doesn't even know where Middle C is, someone laughed. "I give her 30 seconds before she gives up," another voice added. "This is cruel," whispered a woman at a table near the piano. "We shouldn't be watching this." "Oh, come on, Linda," her companion replied. "She brought this on herself. No one forced her to come in here." As Nora approached the piano, she noticed how beautiful it really was up close. The black surface was so perfectly polished, she could see her reflection in it. The keys were pristine white and black, not a single mark or scratch on them. This instrument was probably worth more than most people made in a year. She pulled out the bench and sat down, adjusting the height slightly. The moment she touched the bench, Vincent started his timer. 1 minute starts now, he announced loudly. The pressure was overwhelming. All those eyes on her, all those phones recording, waiting for her to fail. Her mind went blank for a terrifying moment. What should she play? Something simple that would prove she could handle the basics? Something complex to really show her skill? Her hands hovered over the keys, paralyzed by indecision. "Tick-tock," Vincent called out, clearly enjoying her distress. "Come on, lady. Just hit some keys already," someone shouted from across the room. "Maybe she's trying to remember chopsticks," another voice joked, causing a wave of laughter to ripple through the restaurant. Nora closed her eyes and tried to block out the noise. The laughter, the cruelty of it all. She thought about her grandmother, about all those hours spent practicing, about the music that had once been her whole world. She thought about how hungry she was, how tired she was of being invisible, of being dismissed, of being treated like she didn't matter. When she opened her eyes, something had changed. The fear was still there, but underneath it was something stronger. Anger, maybe. Or determination. She had spent years feeling like she didn't deserve to take up space in the world. But in this moment, sitting at this beautiful piano, she remembered who she used to be. 30 seconds left, Vincent announced, his voice cutting through her thoughts. She could hear more comments from the crowd, more laughter, more phones clicking as people recorded what they expected to be her humiliation. Someone made a joke about calling animal control instead of security. The host was already moving toward the piano, probably planning to escort her out the moment Vincent's timer hit 0. But Nora wasn't thinking about any of that anymore. She was thinking about music, about the way it felt when everything came together perfectly, about the power that lived in her fingertips when she let herself remember how to use it. "Time's almost up. Sweetheart," Vincent called out, his voice dripping with fake sympathy. "Last chance to back out gracefully." Instead of backing out, Nora placed her hands on the keys. The room fell completely silent for just a moment, everyone holding their breath to see what would happen next. And then, she began to play. The first note that came from the piano was so pure and clear that it seemed to cut through the air like a blade. Nora's fingers found their home on the keys as if they had never left. The familiar weight of them, the smooth surface, the way they responded to her touch, it all came flooding back in an instant. She started with something gentle, a melody that most people would recognize even if they didn't know its name. The opening notes of Pachelbel's canon in D flowed from the piano, but not the way most people had heard it before. This wasn't the simple, predictable version played at weddings. This was something deeper, richer, with subtle variations that showed a true understanding of the music. The restaurant had gone completely silent. The laughter stopped mid-sentence. Conversations died away. Even the kitchen noise seemed to fade into the background. All that existed was the music and the woman creating it. Vincent, who had been standing with his arms crossed and a smug expression on his face, slowly lowered his hands to his sides. His mouth opened slightly as he realized what he was hearing. This wasn't some amateur trying to play chopsticks. This was real music, played by someone who clearly knew what they were doing. At a table near the piano, an elderly man set down his wine glass so carefully it didn't make a sound. His wife reached over and grabbed his arm, her eyes wide with amazement. They had been to enough concerts in their lives to recognize exceptional talent when they heard it. But Nora was just getting started. As the canon reached its natural conclusion, she didn't stop. Instead, she transitioned seamlessly into something more complex, more personal. Her fingers moved across the keys with impossible speed and precision, playing what sounded like a classical piece, but with modern touches that no one in the room had ever heard before. The host, who had been preparing to escort her out just moments before, found himself frozen in place. He had never heard anything like this in his life. The piano seemed to sing under her hands, each note perfect and purposeful. She wasn't just playing music. She was telling a story, and what a story it was. Through the keys, Nora poured out years of pain, loss, and longing. The music spoke of cold nights and empty stomachs, of dreams that had been broken and hope that refused to die. It was beautiful and heartbreaking at the same time, so honest and raw that several people in the audience felt tears forming in their eyes. A young woman at a corner table had been recording with her phone, expecting to capture something funny to share with her friends. Now she found herself lowering the device, too caught up in the performance to worry about getting it all on video. The music was doing something to her that she couldn't explain, reaching into parts of her heart she had forgotten existed. The technique was flawless. Every trill, every run, every delicate passage was executed with the kind of precision that took years of training to achieve. But more than that, there was soul in it. This wasn't just someone who had learned to play the piano well. This was someone who understood music on a level that few people ever reach. Vincent's timer had long since run out, but no one was thinking about time limits anymore. The manager stood transfixed, watching this woman in worn clothes create something absolutely magnificent on his expensive piano. He thought about all the professional musicians who had played that instrument over the years, the wedding pianists and dinner music performers. None of them had made it sound like this. As the piece built to its climax, Nora's entire body moved with the music. Her shoulders swayed with the rhythm, her head tilted toward the keys as if she were listening to secrets only she could hear. Her fingers danced across the keyboard with such grace and power that it was almost like watching a ballet. The emotional weight of the performance was overwhelming. A businessman at a table near the window found himself thinking about his own struggles, his own moments of desperation and hope. A mother dining with her teenage daughter remembered her own dreams of being a musician, dreams she had given up long ago. The music was reaching everyone in different ways, touching something universal and deeply human. And then, just when it seemed like the intensity couldn't build any higher, Nora began to slow the piece down. The complex runs gave way to simpler, more haunting melodies. The volume decreased, but somehow the emotional impact grew stronger. She was bringing the story to its conclusion, and everyone in the room could feel it. The final notes hung in the air like whispers, so soft and delicate that no one dared to breathe. Nora's hands lifted from the keys slowly, almost reluctantly, as if she didn't want the connection to end. For a moment that felt like forever, the restaurant was completely silent. No one moved. No one spoke. No one even seemed to breathe. They were all still processing what they had just experienced, trying to understand how someone who looked like she had nothing could create something so beautiful. Then, from the back of the restaurant, someone started clapping, slowly at first, then faster. Others joined in, and within seconds, the entire dining room erupted in thunderous applause. People were standing up, some with tears streaming down their faces, others shaking their heads in amazement. The elderly man near the piano was on his feet, clapping harder than anyone else. "Bravo!" he called out, his voice thick with emotion. "Absolutely incredible." Vincent looked around the room at his customers, all of them transformed by what they had just witnessed. These were the same people who had been laughing and making jokes just minutes before. Now they were giving this woman a standing ovation that seemed like it might never end. The host wiped his eyes quickly, hoping no one had noticed the tears. He had been prepared to throw this woman out, to call her crazy for thinking she could just walk in and play their piano. Now he felt ashamed of how he had treated her, how they had all treated her. Nora sat at the piano bench, overwhelmed by the response. She had poured everything she had into that performance, and now she felt empty and full at the same time. The applause washed over her like warm water, healing wounds she had carried for years. But even as the room celebrated her incredible talent, questions were beginning to form in people's minds. Who was this woman? Where had she learned to play like that? How had someone with such extraordinary ability ended up standing in their restaurant, asking for food in exchange for music? The answers to those questions were about to change everything. The applause seemed to go on forever, but Nora barely heard it. She sat at the piano bench, her hands still trembling from the performance, feeling like she had just awakened from a long, dark dream. For the first time in years, she felt like herself again. "Excuse me, miss." A gentle voice cut through the applause. An elderly man with silver hair and kind eyes was making his way toward the piano, moving carefully between the tables. He looked to be in his 70s, wearing a well-tailored jacket and walking with a slight limp. There was something about his face that seemed familiar, but Nora couldn't quite place it. The man stopped a few feet away from the piano, studying her face intently. His expression was a mixture of disbelief and growing recognition. "I'm sorry to bother you," he said softly, his voice carrying a slight accent. "But I have to ask, are you Nora Chen?" The question hit her like a physical blow. She hadn't heard her full name spoken aloud in over 2 years. Most people on the streets just called her by her first name, if they bothered to learn it at all. She stared at the man trying to place his face. How do you know my name?" she whispered, the man's eyes filled with tears. "My dear child, it's me, Professor Williams. From the conservatory." All the air seemed to leave Nora's lungs at once. Professor Williams. Her teacher. Her mentor. The man who had believed in her when she was just a frightened teenager trying to navigate the competitive world of classical music. She hadn't seen him since. "Since everything fell apart, Professor?" Her voice came out as barely a whisper. "I can't believe." "What are you doing here?" "My wife and I were celebrating our anniversary," he said, gesturing toward an elegant woman at a nearby table who was watching with obvious concern. "But that's not important right now. Nora, what happened to you? You just disappeared. One day you were preparing for your debut at Carnegie Hall and then—" He trailed off, taking in her appearance, the worn clothes, the obvious signs of someone who had been living rough. The restaurant had grown quiet again, but this was different from the silence during her performance. People were leaning in, trying to hear this conversation that was clearly revealing something important. Carnegie Hall? Vincent, the manager, stepped closer. His entire demeanor had changed. Gone was the smugness and cruelty from earlier. Now he looked confused and slightly afraid. "You were going to play at Carnegie Hall?" Professor Williams turned to face him, and his voice carried an authority that made everyone in the room pay attention. "This young woman," he said, his words clear and deliberate, "was one of the most promising pianists of her generation. She won the International Young Artist Competition 3 years running. The New York Times called her a once-in-a-lifetime talent when she was just 19 years old." A murmur rippled through the restaurant. People were pulling out their phones again, but not to mock this time. They were searching, looking up her name, trying to find articles and videos of her performances. "I have recordings of her playing with the Boston Symphony," Professor Williams continued. "She was scheduled to debut her own composition at Carnegie Hall when she was 22. The youngest pianist ever to be given that honor." He looked back at Nora, his eyes full of pain, and then she just vanished. No one knew what happened. Nora felt the weight of dozens of eyes on her, but for the first time in years she didn't want to disappear. Maybe it was the music still flowing through her veins, or maybe it was seeing her old teacher again, but she found the courage to speak. "My mother got sick," she said quietly. "Stage 4 cancer. I dropped out of school to take care of her. Used all my savings for treatments that didn't work." Her voice grew stronger as she continued. "After she died, I couldn't play anymore. Every note reminded me of what I'd lost, what I'd given up. I lost my apartment, couldn't pay my bills. I kept telling myself it was temporary, that I'd figure it out, but—" She gestured at herself, at her worn clothes and tired face. "Some problems are bigger than you think they'll be." The silence in the restaurant was deafening. Vincent looked like he wanted to crawl under a table and hide. The host, Tony, was staring at his shoes, probably thinking about every cruel word he had spoken earlier. "There was something in the newspapers," an older woman called out from across the room. She was looking at her phone, scrolling through search results. "About a young pianist who withdrew from a major performance due to family illness." "That was you?" Nora nodded, feeling exposed but somehow relieved to have the truth out there. Professor Williams moved closer to the piano. "Nora, what you just played, that wasn't just technically perfect. That was your composition, wasn't it? The one you were working on for Carnegie Hall?" "Part of it," she admitted. "I've been changing it, adding to it. When you have a lot of time and nothing else to do, you think about music differently." "It was extraordinary," he said firmly, "even more beautiful than I remembered." "You haven't lost anything, my dear. If anything, you've grown as an artist." The young woman who had been recording earlier approached hesitantly. "I'm sorry," she said, looking embarrassed. "I posted part of your performance on social media before I knew who you were. It's already being shared thousands of times. People are calling it one of the most beautiful things they've ever heard." Nora's heart sank. The last thing she wanted was to become some kind of internet sensation, a feel-good story about a homeless musician. But Professor Williams smiled. That might not be such a bad thing. The classical music world never forgot about you, Nora. People have been wondering what happened, hoping you'd come back. This could be your way back in. Vincent stepped forward, looking deeply ashamed. Miss Chen, I owe you an enormous apology. The way I treated you, the way we all treated you. It was inexcusable. Please let me buy you dinner, the finest meal in the house. It's the least I can do. We all owe her an apology, Tony added, his voice shaking slightly. I judged you based on how you looked instead of who you are. That was wrong of me. Around the restaurant, other people were nodding in agreement. The mood had completely shifted. Where there had been mockery and cruelty before, now there was respect and genuine remorse. Professor Williams pulled out his phone. I'm calling some people. Former colleagues, directors of music programs, people who remember your talent. If you're ready to come back to music, I think you'll find that there are more opportunities than you might expect. Nora looked around the room at all these faces, some familiar from her performance, others still registering shock at what they had learned. She thought about the years of silence, the nights when she'd dreamed about playing again but convinced herself it was impossible. I don't know if I'm ready, she said honestly. It's been so long since I was part of that world. The music says otherwise, Professor Williams replied gently. What I heard tonight tells me you're more ready than you think. 6 months later, Nora stood backstage at the Community Arts Center, listening to the sounds of people filling the auditorium. Her hands weren't shaking anymore. The black dress she wore was simple but elegant, donated by a local boutique owner who had seen the video of her restaurant performance. Her hair was clean and styled, and for the first time in years, she felt like she belonged somewhere. 5 minutes until showtime, the stage manager called out. Nora took a deep breath and looked at herself in the mirror. The woman staring back at her was different from the one who had walked into Antonio's restaurant that cold night. This woman had hope in her eyes. The changes hadn't happened overnight. The video of her performance had indeed gone viral, shared millions of times across social media platforms. But it wasn't just the music that captured people's attention. It was the story behind it, the reminder that extraordinary talent could be found in the most unexpected places. The morning after her restaurant performance, Nora had woken up in a real bed for the first time in months. Vincent, the restaurant manager, had insisted on paying for a hotel room and had personally driven her there, apologizing the entire way. I keep thinking about how I treated you, he had said. I can't undo that, but maybe I can do something right going forward. Professor Williams had been true to his word. Within a week, he had connected her with 3 different music programs offering her teaching positions. The director of the local symphony had reached out about guest performances. A recording studio had offered free studio time to help her create a proper demo. But perhaps the most meaningful call had come from the Harrison Foundation, a charity that supported artists in crisis. They offered her not just financial assistance, but counseling services and a mentor program designed specifically for musicians who had fallen on hard times. We've been following your story, the foundation director had explained during their first meeting. What happened to you happens to more artists than people realize. Illness, family crisis, economic hardship. These things can derail even the most talented careers. We want to help you get back on your feet, but we also think you could help us reach others who are in similar situations. Nora had started teaching piano lessons at the community center 3 days a week. Her students ranged from young children learning their first scales to adults who had always dreamed of playing but never had the chance. Teaching reminded her why she had fallen in love with music in the first place. There was 8-year-old Kevin, whose parents worked 3 jobs between them but were determined their son would have music lessons. There was Rosa, a 65-year-old grandmother who had always wanted to play piano but whose family had told her it was a waste of time. There was David, a teenager who had been getting into trouble until music gave him something positive to focus on. Miss Nora, Kevin had said during one of his lessons, why do some songs make people cry? She had smiled, remembering asking her own teacher a similar question years ago. Because music speaks to parts of us that words can't reach, she had told him. It reminds us that we're not alone with our feelings. The restaurant, Antonio's, had also become an unexpected part of her new life. Vincent had offered her a regular weekly performance slot, which she had accepted. Every Thursday night she played for the dinner crowd, and slowly the restaurant had become known for its exceptional live music. The tips from those performances, combined with her teaching income, allowed her to rent a small apartment. Tony, the host who had initially mocked her, had become one of her biggest supporters. He had created a small sign for the restaurant entrance: Thursday Night Piano with Nora Chen, the artist who reminds us never to judge by appearances. I learned something important that night, he had told her during one of her performances. I learned that treating people with dignity isn't about what they can do for you. It's about recognizing that everyone has value, even when you can't see it right away. The young woman who had posted the original video, Jessica, had become a friend. She had used her social media following to promote Nora's performances and had helped organize a fundraising campaign that raised enough money to buy instruments for underprivileged students at the community center. Felt terrible about filming you without permission at first, Jessica had admitted. But then I realized that sometimes the universe puts you in the right place at the right time to help share something important with the world. Tonight's concert was special. It was a benefit performance for the new program Nora had helped develop with the Harrison Foundation, Music for All, which provided instruments, lessons, and performance opportunities for people experiencing homelessness or financial hardship. Professor Williams was in the audience, sitting in the front row with his wife. So was Vincent from the restaurant, along with many of the staff who had witnessed her first performance. Jessica was there with her camera officially this time, documenting the event for the foundation. But most importantly, scattered throughout the audience were her students and the people the program had already helped. Rosa was there, beaming with pride for her teacher. Kevin's entire family had come, despite the babysitting complications it created. David was helping with the sound equipment backstage, having discovered a talent for technical work. And in the back row sat several people Nora recognized from the streets, guests of the foundation who had been given free tickets to the show. Some were musicians themselves, others were simply people who needed to be reminded that better days were possible. "This is your moment," Professor Williams had told her during rehearsal earlier that day. "But it's also about so much more than just you now." He was right. As Nora walked onto the stage to thunderous applause, she thought about the journey that had brought her here. The pain of losing her mother, the years of struggle and hunger, the shame of having to ask for help, the humiliation of being mocked. All of it had led to this moment. She sat at the grand piano, a beautiful instrument donated specifically for this performance. The audience settled into expectant silence, the same kind of silence she had faced that night at the restaurant. But this time she wasn't alone. This time she was surrounded by people who believed in her, who had invested in her success, who saw her as valuable regardless of her circumstances. "Good evening," she said into the microphone. "6 months ago I asked if I could play for a piece of food. Tonight I'm playing so that others won't have to ask for what they need. This first piece is dedicated to everyone who has ever felt invisible, and to those who chose to really see them." She began to play the same composition she had performed that night at Antonio's. But it was different now. Richer, more complex, infused with gratitude and hope instead of just pain and longing. The music told the story of falling down and getting back up, of being broken and becoming whole again, of finding family in unexpected places. As the last notes faded away, Nora looked out at the audience and saw her life reflected back at her. It wasn't perfect. She still struggled sometimes, still had days when the weight of everything felt overwhelming. But she was no longer alone, no longer invisible, no longer afraid to take up space in the world. The applause was warm and genuine, but what mattered most was knowing that this was just the beginning. There were more students to teach, more programs to develop, more people to help find their way back to whatever they had lost. Music had saved her life. Now she was determined to help it save others.